Welcome to Lesson 6, Security Operations and Administration. In this lesson, you're going to learn about explaining the role of IT operations, administration, and security policies. Some key concepts include role of security administration within an organization, components of IT security policy infrastructure, data classification standards used by organizations in the DoD, change management and configuration management, the system development lifecycle, and the system lifecycle. Security professionals must understand how security operations and administration create the foundation for a solid security program. Your role as a security professional is similar to that of a coach. You work with staff to identify the strengths and weaknesses of your players or your assets. Your goal is to win the game. In the world of a security professional, the game is to secure your organization's resources. Your opponents are unauthorized users trying to steal your data and use it against you. As a coach, you have a playbook of strategies. You need to keep these strategies out of the hands of your opponents. You also need to make sure your strategies abide by the rules and regulations of the industry. To prepare them for the challenge, you must educate and train your players. You must give them the skills they need to work together as a team and win the game. If you're successful, your organization will run as smoothly as a championship team. Everybody will understand the mission and how to work together to complete it. If you fail, your team will appear confused. Each player will seem to do his or her own thing, regardless of the consequences. The next thing you know, your organization's information will fall into the hands of your opponents. Your trade secrets will no longer be secret. Your organization will spend a lot of money fixing what's broken, and you and your employees might find yourselves on the bench or even looking for other jobs. In this lesson, I'm going to teach you the skills you need to develop a strong security administration team. Security administration within an organization refers to the group of individuals responsible for planning, designing, implementing, and monitoring an organization's security plan. Before you can form an administrative team, your organization must identify its information assets. After your organization identifies and documents the assets, you should assign responsibility of each one to a person or a position. Once you have a list of assets and know who is responsible for each one, you can form the team. This administrative team then determines the sensitivity of each asset so that it can plan how to secure each one accordingly. The primary task of an organization's security administration team is to control access to systems or resources. There are 4 aspects of access control. First, you have identification. These are assertions made by users about who they are, showing an ID or something like that. Then you have authentication. This is proving that assertion, that's who they are. Next is authorization. This is the permissions a legitimate user or process has on the system. And then accountability, tracking or logging what authenticated and unauthenticated users do while accessing the system. The security administration team leads these efforts by determining the best security controls to put in place to secure your organization's resources. The security administration team handles the planning, design, implementation, and monitoring of your organization's security program. Several types of documentation are necessary to provide the input the security administration team needs to make the best decisions to secure assets. The most common documentation requirements includes the following. First, you have sensitive asset lists. This is what assets must the organization take measures to secure. The list can include computers, network components, databases, documents, and any other assets that could be vulnerable to attack. Second, the organization's security process. This is how it does all its work. Third is the authority of the persons responsible for security. This is which administrator is responsible or authorized for what assets and what actions. And finally, the policies, procedures, and guidelines adopted by the organization. This is what information needs to be communicated, how it's communicated, and when it's communicated. The security administration team puts together all the pieces of a puzzle to ensure your organization complies with stated policies. An organization must comply with rules on 2 levels. You have regulatory compliance, which is the organization must comply with laws and government regulations, and you have organizational compliance, which is the organization must comply with its own policies, audits, culture, and standards. As a result, the security administration team's documentation, procedures, and guidelines focus on compliance and compliance monitoring. They have to make sure the organization follows the various rules and regulations. The security administration team's responsibilities include handling events that affect your computers and networks. These include incidents, disasters, and other interruptions. The security administration team forms an incident response team to handle any security incidents. This team is composed of individuals who are responsible for responding to incidents and investigating security breaches. Another team managed by the Security Administration Team is the Emergency Operations Group. This group is responsible for protecting sensitive data in the event of natural disasters and equipment failure, among other potential emergencies. Despite the best efforts of the Incident Response Team, the Emergency Operations Group, and the system administrators, all systems are subject to failure or attack. The Security Administration Team ensures that an organization can respond rapidly and effectively to any event. Many organizations rely on outside firms to handle security monitoring and analysis. This means you might need to monitor the work of the outsourcing firm or work with it when handling incidents. This approach has both disadvantages and advantages. For advantages, a security management firm has a high level of expertise because it focuses on security and security only every day. So simply put, it will have expertise and experience that your organization might not have. For disadvantages, outsourcing has two primary disadvantages. First, the outsourcing firm might not know your organization well and might not possess internal knowledge. Second, by outsourcing, you won't develop in-house capability or talent and will therefore need to continue to pay for these services indefinitely. Here are some outsourcing considerations. The Security Administration Team must work closely with an outside firm to make sure both agree to specific security requirements. Integrating data or processing with third parties introduces new threats. Relocating data or processes, or both, outside your own data centers raises trust questions. How can you trust another organization to protect your intellectual property? Though there are many concerns to address when outsourcing, the main concerns include privacy. Does the third party agree to uphold your privacy policy? How do they plan to control how data are collected, stored, handled, and destroyed? Risk. What additional risks exist by transferring data over a trusted boundary? How are any new risks addressed? Who is responsible for managing new outsourcing risks? Next is data security. What controls protect data confidentiality and integrity from unauthorized access? Are access controls consistent with internal controls? How is data availability protected? Are backups and redundancy measures in place to minimize downtime? How are backups and redundant data copies protected? Next is ownership. Who owns the data, the infrastructure, and the media? Who is responsible for each component? And finally is adherence to policy. Does each third party commit to upholding your security policies and procedures? Several types of agreements are common when outsourcing to external organizations. These agreements help to formalize answers to the preceding questions that I just asked. A list of the most common agreements that define how an outstanding relationship would include service level agreements. This type of agreement is a formal contract between your organization and an outside firm that details the specific services the firm will provide. Some examples of security-related services detailed in the SLA can include how and when potential security breaches are communicated, how log and events are reported, how confidential data are handled, and what the security system uptime requirements are. For example, you might require that all critical systems have 99.99% reliability. The SLA should communicate the expectations of both the organization and the outside firm. The SLA should anticipate the needs of both parties. Each member of the Security Administration Team must thoroughly analyze his or her department's risks. Any unaccounted risk is likely to cost your organization in terms of either data loss or expenses to fix it. Think of this as similar to maintaining an automobile. Regular oil changes are less expensive than blown out head gaskets. Maintaining an engine is cheaper than fixing one. Next is the blanket purchase agreement. This is a streamlined method of meeting recurring needs for supplies or services. A BPA creates pre-approved accounts with qualified suppliers to fulfill recurring orders for products or services. BPAs can be very helpful in simplifying the process of recurring purchases. Next, you have Memorandum of Understanding, also called a Letter of Intent. An MOU is an agreement between two or more parties that expresses areas of common interest that result in shared actions. MOUs are generally less enforceable than a formal agreement, but still more formal than an oral agreement. And finally, you have interconnection security agreements. Often an extension of an MOU, the ISA serves as an agreement that documents the technical requirements of interconnected assets. This type of document is most often used to specify technical needs and security responsibilities of connected organizations. Your organization's security policy sets the tone for the way you approach security activities. It also states the rules with which you must comply. Think of a security policy in terms of traffic laws. Traffic laws maintain a certain degree of order and safety on the roads. If these laws aren't enforced, the roads become dangerous. An information security policy is no different. Your security policy isn't much good if it isn't enforced. This is where compliance enters the picture. When policies are enforced, the organization complies with those policies. There are three primary means to ensure compliance. You have event logs, you have compliance liaison, and you have remediation. You can learn more about each of these in your book on page 186. One of the most important roles security professionals assume is that of leadership in compliant behavior. People won't follow the rules if they don't trust the leaders. Every respected profession has its own code of ethics and conduct. Adhering to such a code fosters the respect of any profession's practitioners. The security profession is no different from other professions in this regard. It is important that security professionals have a definite code of ethics that governs their behavior. Most security certification organizations publish their code of ethics. In fact, most certifications require candidates to adhere to a specific code of ethics before qualifying for the certification. For example, both ISC Square and CompTIA provide solid ethical guidelines. However, guidelines aren't effective unless you adopt and practice those guidelines. Here are some tips for practicing strong ethics. First, set the example. Demonstrate strong ethical principles in your daily activities. Users will follow your lead. If you are serious about ethics, your users will be more serious about ethics. Next is encourage adopting ethical guidelines and standards. Security professionals must know their ethical boundaries and set an example by adhering to them. This often means making difficult decisions and setting a good example. You must push the organization to define its code of ethics. This helps the staff operate ethically and responsibly. Next is inform users through security awareness training. Make sure users are aware of and understand their ethical responsibility. A code of ethics helps ensure professionalism. For all the technical solutions you can devise to secure your systems, the human element remains your greatest challenge. You might be surprised how far a little education can go. If your staff are aware of how security risks can hurt both themselves and the organization, they'll be more likely to help you run a tight ship. It's important to know what a user should and shouldn't do. The best way to accomplish this goal is to create well-defined job descriptions, job roles, and responsibilities. When you know what people should be doing, it's easier to identify activities they aren't supposed to do. If their roles or responsibilities are vague, it's more difficult to flag bad behavior, which means people are more likely to get away with things. Minimizing access to information and assets is an important security control. You have already learned about some concepts related to personnel security. These concepts are very important and bear revisiting. Pay careful attention to any security concepts that directly affect personnel. People are the most important assets in your organization, so it's vital that they know how to contribute to maintaining your organization's security. Let's look at some of the principles. First, we have limiting access. When deciding how to grant access to users, one of the core concepts is limiting access. The idea that users should be granted only the levels of permissions they need in order to perform their duties is called the principle of least privilege. You want to remember that. Always use this principle. Otherwise, you run the risk of allowing unauthorized users access to information they shouldn't be able to access. For example, weak access control may allow a sales clerk to view employee salaries. The need to know requirement, which falls under limiting access, is another concept that relates to the principle of least privilege. This states that people should have access only to information they need to perform their jobs, regardless of the employee's clearance level. So even though users might have a top secret security clearance, it doesn't mean they should have access to all top secret information. They need access to only that information they need to do their jobs. Let's move to separations of duties. Separation of duties breaks a task into subtasks that different users must carry out. This means a single user cannot carry out a critical task without the help or approval of another user. To put it another way, a user who plans to harm a system must get help from others. A conspiracy is hard to organize and hard to hide. For example, separation of duties helps ensure that an employee cannot create a new vendor and cut a check to that vendor. That prevents an employee from opening a bank account for Acme Consulting, going into the system at work to create a new vendor named Acme Consulting, and then cutting a check for $1,000 to Acme Consulting. Let's move to job rotation. Another way to protect your organization from personnel-related security violations is to use job rotation. Job rotation minimizes risk by rotating employees among various systems or duties. This prevents collusion, where several employees conspire to commit fraud. It also gives managers a chance to track which users were authorized to take what actions and when. If other security measures have failed, job rotation provides an opportunity to find the security breach before it inflicts more harm. Job rotation also provides trained backup since several employees learn the skills of specific jobs. Move to the mandatory vacation box. Much like job rotation, mandatory vacations provide the chance to detect fraud. When users are on vacation, you should suspend their access to your environment. This prevents them from working from home, where they might attempt to cover their tracks. Under U.S. banking rules, for example, certain bank employees must take 2 consecutive weeks of vacation. Until recently, the law forbade managers from contacting these vacation employees with work-related matters. That rule has been relaxed to allow for read-only access to systems so that employees can at least keep up with their email correspondence. However, they still cannot participate in work-related activities while on vacation. Next is security training. Because personnel is so important to solid security, one of the best security controls you can develop is a strong security training and awareness program. Security training helps gain the support of all employees. They become security advocates who are motivated to comply with policies that relate to their jobs. They are careful to avoid security breaches. You should train employees, then train them again at specified intervals. This repeated training refreshes employees' knowledge and reminds them of the importance of security. Well-trained personnel can make the difference between a security environment and a collection of attacks and mistakes. Employees should be aware of security threats to an organization, especially from human factors. These threats include installing rogue technologies, selecting weak passwords, and phishing attacks. These types of threats are common because so many organizations fail to train their personnel on the importance of recognizing them. Simply explaining how weak passwords can endanger personal and business information can often encourage users to create stronger passwords. Next is security awareness. A security awareness program should address the requirements and expectations of your security policy. The security policy requires actions and provides authority for security controls. It's one of the best forms of defense. Employees are more likely to comply with the security control if they realize the policy mandates it. In addition to explaining why each part of your policy is necessary, the program should explain the penalties for policy violations. An awareness program is different from a formal training program. Most users don't understand what security is and why it's necessary. You can use security awareness programs, including posters, emails, and employee newsletters, among other tools, to do the following: to teach users about security objectives, to inform users about trends and threats in security, and to motivate users to comply with security policies. Employees generally want to do what's best for the company. When security seems to get in the way of their productivity, however, they'll often bypass security measures to complete their work more quickly. For example, suppose an employee Bob is home for the weekend and receives a call from another employee, Sue, at the office. Sue says she needs Bob's password to get to a file or system so she can finish a project. No matter how often you remind employees of the risk of sharing passwords, most people will still be quick to give up their passwords in this situation. It's your job to reinforce the importance of following security policies. It's also your job to teach them how to solve productivity problems and still maintain a high level of security. Awareness programs can remind staff about security policies. These programs can also measure how well the staff follows the security policy. The programs provide staff with practical advice on how to deal with security incidents. A good program convinces staff that security is their personal duty. You can help employees change their behavior such that security becomes a part of their daily routine. Next is social engineering. One of the most popular types of attack on computer systems involves social engineering. Social engineering is deceiving or using people to get around security controls. Because most people want to be helpful, it's not too hard for an attacker to convince someone with system access to do something he or she shouldn't do. It's one of the most critical areas of security. As you grant more employees access to systems and data, the risk of security breach goes up. Technical solutions will not stop an authorized user from calling an unauthorized person and reading sensitive data over the phone. The best way to avoid social engineering is to ensure that you train your personnel to recognize social engineering attempts and how well to handle such attacks. Your security training should cover the most common types of social engineering attacks, including intimidation, name dropping, appeals for help, and phishing. Every company operates within a complex combination of laws, regulations, requirements, competitors, and partners. In addition, morale, labor relations, productivity costs, and cash flow affect how a company operates. Within this environment, management must develop and publish an overall security statement and directives. From the security's perspective, a security program addresses these directives through policies and their supporting elements such as standards, procedures, baselines, and guidelines. Your security policy sets the organization's tone and culture. As a security professional, you are often required to apply policy intent. You must understand the details of your organization's security policy. The policy is the highest level statement of values and directions. Your organization's standards, baseline procedures, and guidelines implement your security policy. The role of a security professional is to provide support for these elements. This support includes informing staff of policies, training, and enforcement. You can cover these in your book, but let's take a quick look at what they are. Written security policies document management's goals and objectives. They explain the company's security needs and their commitments to meeting those goals. A security policy should read like a short summary of key facts. If the policy is too complex, management has trouble embracing and approving it. Standards are mandated requirements for hardware and software solutions used to address security risks throughout an organization. Standards might refer to a specific antivirus product or a password generation token. Simply put, when a standard is in place, it means the organization has selected a solution, and that solution only, to fulfill a policy goal. Procedures are step-by-step systematic actions to accomplish a security requirement, process, or objective. They are one of the most powerful tools available to you. They can provide documentation of the way you do business and ensure that no employee's critical knowledge remains only in his or her head. For baselines, in many cases, it is helpful to define basic configurations for specific types of computers or devices. For example, having a document that lists the components and configuration settings for a standard workstation make it easy to ensure that all new workstations are the same. Security personnel often create such basic configurations called baselines to ensure that they enforce the security minimums. Baselines are the benchmarks to help make sure a minimum level of security exists across multiple applications of systems and across different products. Finally, organizations often use guidelines to help provide structure to the security program. They outline recommendations for the purchase and use of acceptable products and systems. Guidelines are simply actions that the organization recommends. These guidelines usually exist in the form of white papers, best practices, or other formats defined by our organization's security program. The security policy environment is composed of overarching organizational policy and management security statement. Here's the security policy hierarchy. Mandatory access control involves assigning each object a specific classification. Classifying information often relies on the regulations that apply to the specific type of data. Examples include the protection of personal information, financial information, and health information. Classifying data is the duty of the person who owns the data or someone the owner assigns. You can refer to this person as the data owner. A similar term, system owner, refers to the person or group that manages the infrastructure. System owners are often in control of change or configuration management. System owners are not in control of data classification. It's important for you to understand the difference between clearance and classification. The authorization grants clearance to users. The data owner assigns a classification to data. Systems enforce access control by determining that a subject has the right clearance to access a classified object. Operating systems usually enforce access restrictions along with the principles of least privilege or need to know, which I talked about a little while ago. Organizations take into account three criteria in classifying information. First, you have value. You can define the value of information by several different measures. The value to the organization, the value to competitors, the cost of replacement or loss, and the value to the organization's reputation. Sensitivity. Sensitivity is the measure of the effect that a breach of the integrity or the disclosure of information will have on the organization. Organizations can measure sensitivity in many ways, including liability or fines, reputation, credibility, or loss of market share. Criticality is the measure of the importance of the information to the mission of the organization. What would happen to the organization if the information was lost? The objectives of classifying information are as follows: to identify information protection requirements, which are based on the risk the business faces if the information is disclosed or the data or system are corrupted; to identify value in accordance with organization policy; to ensure that sensitive and/or critical information is provided appropriate protection and controls; to lower costs by protecting only sensitive information; to standardize classification labeling throughout the organization; to alert employees and other unauthorized and other authorized personnel to protection requirements, and to comply with privacy laws and regulations. The U.S. government uses a hierarchical series of classifications that include unclassified, restricted, confidential, secret, and top secret. The private sector uses various categories such as public, private, and confidential. Government classifications are well known and standardized. Company-related classifications are less well known and are not standardized. This creates issues for the private sector. For example, when an employee changes jobs, the new employee might value private above confidential. In his old job, his employer valued private below confidential. That's confusing. It's even more confusing when this happens within the same company. Part of a security professional's job is to identify these inconsistencies and make recommendations to correct them. It is unusual for any component in a network computer environment to remain unchanged for a long period. Organizations commonly make modifications to the hardware, software, firmware, documentation, test plans, and test documentation of an automated system throughout the system's lifecycle. It's important that all configuration changes occur only within a controlled process. Uncontrolled configuration changes often result in conflicts and even new security vulnerabilities. The process of managing all changes to computer and device configurations is called configuration management. From the perspective of a security professional, configuration management evaluates the impact a modification might have on security. Will it affect the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of the system, application, or documentation? As a security professional, your job is twofold. First, to ensure that you adequately review all system changes, and second, to ensure that the change to the configuration will not cause unintended consequences for security. You must control all modifications to ensure that the change will affect your environment as expected and that your environment will operate as authorized. Many organizations lack a hardware inventory that tells them what they have, who has ownership or possession of it, and which department of systems are using it. This is a serious gap in the security program. In the event of a fire, equipment failure, or theft, this lack of documentation can slow the response and extend operational loss. It also makes proper configuration management extremely difficult, if not impossible. A decision to roll out new patch, service pack, or release will be complicated if you can't find, update, and test every affected device. You must have an up-to-date map or layout of the configuration of the hardware components. This helps ensure that you configure all systems according to the baseline. It also ensures that you properly review the work completed on the system or network so that you can make the correct changes without bypassing any security features. You should also regularly check for any available vendor upgrades and service packs. This process may be an involved one if you have many types of software and hardware from different vendors. Nevertheless, it's necessary to address all known vulnerabilities. It is common to discuss change and configuration control as a pair of activities, but they are really two ends of a spectrum. The confusion, of course, lies where a particular activity crosses from one to the other. Drawing a sharp line between the two is difficult because different organizations of different complexities will draw the line in different places. Configuration control is the management of the baseline settings for a system device. The baseline settings meet security requirements. They require that you implement them carefully and only with prior approval. Change control is the management of changes to the configuration. Unmanaged changes introduce risks because they might affect security operations or controls. An improper change could even disable the system or equipment. Change controls ensures that any changes to a production system are tested, documented, and approved. The change itself must follow a change control process that ensures that you make the change correctly and report it to management. Change control management develops a planned approach to controlling change by involving all affected departments. The objective is to maximize the benefit for all people involved in the change and minimize the risk of failure. To be effective, change management should be multidisciplinary, touching all aspects of the organization. Nevertheless, an organization should not be constrained so much that it loses all flexibility. Change management should allow organizations to adopt new technologies, improvements, and modifications. Change management requires a written policy approved by the Chief Information Officer or the IT Director and the Business Information Security Manager. The policy must define all roles, responsibilities, and procedures related to change management. Here are some important things you should remember. You should communicate change management procedures and standards effectively. They should define the techniques and technologies you use throughout the enterprise in support of the policy. Change management can be either reactive or proactive. With reactive change management, management responds to changes in the business environment. The source of the change is external. Some examples are changes in regulations, customer expectations, and the supply chain. With proactive change management, management initiates a change to achieve a desired goal. In this case, the source of the change is internal, such as adoption of new technology. Your organization can conduct change management in several ways. It can occur on a continuous basis, a regularly scheduled basis, a release basis, or when you deem it necessary on a program-by-program basis. A senior business process owner should lead a change control committee. This committee oversees all proposed changes to systems and networks. The committee approves changes and the schedule for implementing the changes. In this manner, you cannot make changes to a system, application, or network without the proper review, funding, and documentation. In cooperation with IT, the Change Control Committee, in some cases called a Change Control Board, that's what we call it in my organization, provides the oversight to protect the computing resources and the data contained within those applications and databases. As part of the change process, key members meet with counterparts from the IT organizations to review upcoming plans and ensure that you properly evaluate all changes. They also make sure that the necessary security controls have been applied and evaluated. They communicate their findings to all parts of the organization. In brief, the primary objectives of the Change Control Committee are to ensure all changes are properly tested, authorized, scheduled, communicated, and documented. When you use solid change control, identifying recent changes that might have caused a production problem is easy. That simplifies the problem resolution process and makes your environment more secure. Here are the change control procedures. Change control procedures ensure that a change does not happen without following the right steps. This helps you avoid problems such as scope creep, which allows unauthorized changes to sneak into a system. It also helps avoid problems caused by lack of oversight, by lack of testing, or by making changes without proper authorization. Here are a sequence of change control procedures. First, you have the request. In the request stage, you should describe all proposed changes in writing and submit the change request to the Change Control Committee for review. You should never make a change to a system without approval. Next is impact assessment. The impact assessment stage evaluates the effect of the change on the budget, resources, and security of your system or a project. Next is approval. The approval, or in some cases disapproval stage, is the formal review and acceptance or rejection of the change by the Change Control Committee. Next is build/test. The build/test stage is the actual development or building of the change according to the approved change document. You then must test the change to ensure that it does not cause unexpected problems for other systems or components. This testing might include regression testing and an in-depth review of the security of the modified product. Next is implementation. Once you test the change and approve it for release, you can schedule the installation process. This is where adequate separation of duty ensures that no one person can make the change without proper review and oversight. The final hurdle is notifying management that you have the change successfully. As you see, there's also an arrow with monitor. So in this stage, you must monitor all systems to ensure that the system, program, network, and other resources are working correctly. You should address any user issues or requests using your organization's problem resolution procedures. Monitoring might identify the need for future changes. This restarts the change control process. Solid change control procedures include the components that tend to identify issues and provide recovery avenues if needed. A successful change control program should include the following elements to ensure the quality of the change control process. Peer reviews. This ensures that a peer or another expert double checks all changes before you put them into production. Peers can often catch problems before they make it to the testing phase. Next is a backup plan. These ensure that if the change doesn't work properly, a plan exists to restore the system to a known good condition. In spite of the best control procedures, you may accidentally release changes that have unintended effects. You must know how to undo or back out of a destructive change. And last is documentation. You should keep documentation current to reflect the true system's design. You should keep backup copies off-site as well. Documentation is necessary to understand how the system is supposed to operate. One critical area of concern is application software. Attackers know that the software development process is complex and that the result of the process is often an application that contains weaknesses. Secure software can be difficult to write. It requires attention to security at every stage of the process, as well as a structured process to ensure that the software does just what it's supposed to do. There are several popular methods to describe and control the systems and software development process. Understanding the process of software development is important in developing software with very few weaknesses. You should be familiar with two of the most popular methods, the system lifecycle and the system development lifecycle. The steps in these processes are very similar, except that the system lifecycle includes operations and disposal, and the system development lifecycle ends with the transition to production. For some organizations, maintenance and new development are done by developers, making them part of system development lifecycle. For others, specialized maintenance teams handle maintenance and development, making them part of SLC. More and more organizations use the term system development lifecycle to describe the entire change and maintenance process for application and system software. This slide covers the common steps used in the system development lifecycle. The more you as a security professional can be involved in each step, the more likely the needed security will be built into the system from the start. The main justification for system lifecycle and for building security at the start is reducing or avoiding costs. The common steps used in the SLC are as follows, and I'll let you read this in the book to get the details. But first is project initiation and planning, functional requirements and definition, system design specification, build/develop and document, acceptance testing, implementation, which is transition to production, operations and maintenance, and finally disposal of the system. Again, read those in your book, page 204 and 205. Security professionals often help test new systems or upgrades to existing systems. These tests should be thorough enough to ensure that you test for all expected and unexpected actions and you handle errors correctly. You should also perform tests to test the maximum load on the system, including transaction volume, memory allocation, network bandwidth, and response times. If you use production or sensitive data in testing, make sure you take steps to keep these data secure. Since input validation attacks are so common, your security personnel should work with software testing personnel to make sure tests catch any input vulnerabilities. One of the types of testing for input vulnerabilities is called fuzzing. Fuzzing is the practice of providing random input to software to see how it handles unexpected data. Fuzzing can help identify input vulnerabilities better than testers trying to think of bad input. In order to catch vulnerabilities, you should thoroughly evaluate any change to your environment, formalize your process for procuring new equipment, follow the guidance in your data policies, review a system throughout its lifecycle to ensure that it meets specified security, which is certification, and you can read more about that in your book on page 207, and make sure management officially accepts the system, which is the accreditation phase, which you learn more on 208. You learned earlier in this lesson about the importance of developing secure software. Software development requires special attention from a security perspective. Applications represent the most common avenue for users, customers, and attackers to access data. That means you must build a software to enforce the security policy and to ensure compliance with regulations, including the privacy and integrity of both data and systems processes. Regardless of the development model your organization adopts, you should make sure that the application properly performs the tests that you see on this screen. You can learn more about each of these in your book. Secure software development requires a formal model for creating and modifying software. This process is known as the Software Development Lifecycle, or SDLC, which uses industry best practices to guide software development activities as projects with specific start and end dates and a set of required deliverables. At this time, the two most widely accepted models for software development include the waterfall model, based on traditional project management practices in which extensive planning precedes any development. Progress through a project moves forward along a well-defined path with the waterfall model. And you have agile development method. This is the newer model that we see these days and is actually better. A newer family of project management approaches that depends on very short sprints of activity. Agile works well in very dynamic environments where requirements change and are often revisited. We use this every day on my job. Many current software development methods base their models on the waterfall model. This is a sequential process for developing software. It includes the SDLC and SLC you learned about earlier. In the waterfall model, progress flows downward like a waterfall. The essence of the waterfall model is that no phase begins until the previous phase is complete. The basic waterfall model originated in the manufacturing and construction industries. It's a feature of highly structured physical environments in which late revisions are very costly, if not entirely cost productive. Traditional software development management is still based largely on some variation of the waterfall method. During the 1990s, some organizations began to realize that the software industry was changing in different ways. Increasing demands to develop more complex software more efficiently led to new methods of managing software development. Instead of managing large projects with long delivery schedules, many organizations looked for ways to be more responsive. They wanted to be able to develop their software in smaller pieces. This move towards smaller development cycles eventually became known as the Agile development method. Agile loosely describes a method of developing software that is based on small project iterations or sprints instead of long project schedules. Organizations that use Agile produce smaller deliverables more frequently and can evaluate a large project in terms of its individual pieces as they are completed. Sprints are generally 1 to 4 weeks in duration. That means there is some deliverable once or more frequently each month. This focus on frequent delivery makes it possible to see and use pieces of a large software product as it matures over time. In this chapter, you learned that security professionals must understand that security operations and administration are the basis of any solid security program. You learn how security administration works to plan, design, implement, and monitor an organization's security plan. You learn that professional ethics are essential for every solid security plan. You also learn what you have to do to make sure your security program is compliant. You learn how the policies, standards, guidelines, and procedures of your plan work together to shape your security program. You learn how data classification standards affect the decision-making process. You also learn how to use configuration management to manage systems modifications and how configuration control and change control affect the change management process. You explore the 8 common steps of the system lifecycle, the system development lifecycle, and how these steps reduce costs. You also learn why software development methods require special security considerations. Finally, you learn how user awareness is pivotal to the success of your security program. That is it for lesson number 6. I'll see you in lesson number 7.